So good morning, everyone, and welcome to CG. You may have noticed all these barrels stacked up in the other room there, and you may think that our research here is fueled by vast quantities of alcohol. Well, that's not the reason why we have all these big barrels there. It's because this building, many of you have commented on what a beautiful building this is. Well, this building used to be a warehouse for the Seagram distillery. Seagram is the distillery that makes the Crown Royal whiskeys, the rye whiskey. This is a building that was constructed in 1857, and in the 1980s it became the company museum, and then it was purchased by CG. You've also noticed a big construction site right next to it. Well, that's the CG campus that's expanding. In fact, the expansion is quite a bit bigger than the original CG. And the CG campus will house, as of this coming September, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, which is a unique partnership involving CG, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the University of Waterloo. This school, the Balsillie School, already exists, and over the last 4 years it has offered interdisciplinary master's program in global governance and international public policy, as well as a unique PhD program in global governance. Now, CG has 4 core programs: global economy, energy and environment, development, and security. We focus primarily on the analysis of governance institutions and mechanisms to gauge their effectiveness, legitimacy, relevance, and impact. And we see our missions as building bridges between the research community and the policy community, with the aim of advancing credible research that can lead to policy innovations. As Tom Burns told you on Thursday evening, a major program priority has been and continues to be the G20 and the functioning of the international financial system. A number of major pieces of work have come out of CG in the recent past. One, a major report on the Financial Stability Board, which tracked performance of this new body over its first year of operation. We've also published a report with Chatham House on the G20's efforts to promote economic policy coordination among its industrialized and emerging nation members. Many projects currently underway in CG relate to high priority issues in the United Nations itself. I'm thinking here of our work on security sector governance, on climate change, or on the strengthening of the IAEA, which is a follow-on to a 3-year project which I chaired on the so-called nuclear renaissance and its implication for global governance in matters of nuclear safety, security, and cooperation. The report was issued in February 2010, and it contains a number of recommendations for improved international cooperation, some of which have turned out to be particularly pertinent in the light of the Fukushima disaster. We also have a number of projects relating to development issues, including a major Africa initiative and a more recent project on development paradigm post-MDGs, which Barry Caron is co-leading with Mukesh Kapila from the Federation of the Red Cross. As for myself, having completed the work on nuclear governance, I'm back to my favorite subject, UN reform, and I will attempt to document, to provide a comprehensive picture of all the reforms, and there were many, that were introduced in the UN since the end of the Cold War. Finally, and to mention all our connections with the UN, the chair of CG's board, Jim Balsillie, is currently serving on the UN's Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability. Its final report is expected by the end of 2011, and the panel has been asked to explore approaches for building a low-carbon, green, and resilient economy that can also work to eradicate poverty. This morning, we have two panels that will explore the state of the international system. The first panel, which is sponsored by CG, will examine the new geometry of Summitry. And you have a number of very distinguished panelists to address this issue. The second panel, which as you know is sponsored by the Stanley Foundation, will delve into the concept of adaptive leadership. And we can look forward to an analytical discussion of global citizenship and the norms and values attached to its practice. So this promises to be a very interesting and stimulating Saturday morning. And without further ado, I will invite the moderator of the panel, Shin-wha Lee, to take over the proceedings. Thank you very much. Welcome again.
Thank you very much. It's a very beautiful building. I'm happy to be here this morning. Well, since we are running late, we'll just start our roundtable right away. This panel is on new geometry of Summitry for universal and functional issues management. Well, concerning the future of G20, a lot have been talked, whether we have to stay at the leaders level or it should return to the finance ministers meeting. But presuming it stays at the leaders level, at least the three questions might be raised. Just briefly, first, will the G20 stick to an economic and financial sectors or extend their leadership to a broader agenda? Of course, the G20 has been discussing about pressing hybrid issues such as economic or global implication of global climate change or global pandemic issues. But what about the purely or largely political security issues at the leaders level? And then that leads to our second question, how to balance with the existing multilateral mechanisms such as G8, IMF, and the UN. In this year, 2011, the 10 G20 members, that means 6 G8 members are on the seat of the Security Council. Then this kind of overlap will be good for partnership between G20 and UN, or that's going to be conflicting each other, or that will eventually G20 can replace the role of the UN. And those questions we can think about. Lastly, role of the middle power leadership. Although G20 is the partnership or relation with the external existing international organizations, I believe that there are also a lot of internal challenges which are derived from different philosophies or experience, language, or culture, or conflicting interest of its member state is always there. In that case, what would be the role of middle power leadership or rising powers role within G20 or within the United Nations? So having said those things, I'm privileged to have the most distinguished scholars who tackled with these issues. So let's go for Barry Caron first on G20, and then the G8, G20 evolution, and the UN particular Security Council issues in Sam Do, and then finally the rising power on the Gregory Chin. So let's start with Barry.
Did.
Firing it up now.
Firing
Is that yours? Okay.
Well, good morning. It's a privilege to be here. Let me start with a couple of disclaimers and an aphorism, I guess, or a story. First disclaimer is I have to apologize. I was trained as an economist. I'm an economist. An economist is someone who does not know what he's talking about and makes it feel that it's your fault. And the second disclaimer, I think, given the amount of time that I've been allotted, 10 or 15 minutes, I remind myself of something Pedro Milan once said was, this complex topic I've worked on for years. Asked my wife, how am I going to explain to these people everything that I know, all the stuff that I know, everything that I have to communicate in just 10 minutes? And she said, speak very slowly. On this issue, I'm reminded of the story of which I saw, a joke actually that I found in a Chinese joke book. It's a Chinese joke. A gentleman is going home from work and by bus, and just as he gets to the bus stop, the bus driver doesn't see him and takes off. He chases the bus to the next intersection because there's a red traffic light there. And just as he gets there, the light turns green just before the bus driver sees him. Off he goes, and he misses the bus at that stop. And this goes on, bus stop, intersection, traffic light, until, bedraggled, all sweaty, the gentleman's home. Chased the bus all the way home. And he walked in and very proudly told his spouse what happened and that he saved bus fare. And his spouse was very, very angry and wanted to know why he did not chase a taxi. That's my message on the G20, basically, is the G20 is the bus. So I've been given this particular topic. My storyline is, in a minute or two, we can ask ourselves whether or not the world needs saving. I want to dismiss the G8, which I personally would like to I'll dismiss it very, very quickly. Remind you a little bit of the G20 stuff you probably all know, but bears repeating. And then go through a minute or two on the constraints on any G20 host, because we have to be practical. And then say something about the criteria for future items on the agenda. And most important, I wanted to remind you of the fact that the most critical contribution that the G20 makes is in its remits to other organizations, to groups of ministers, to working groups, to get things done. It basically sets up, or has the potential of setting up a tremendous amount of work and research on policy issues of various kinds. And I'll give you some suggestions of what are some potential things that future G20 hosts might want to do. So does the world need saving? Yes and no. There are views that the UNFCCC, there's no way that the current machinery is going to come up with an agreement. There's no way that we're going to agree to binding targets. The U.S. has to go from, some 20 tons per capita down to about 2 tons per capita by 2050 in order to meet the 450 parts per million target, the 2-degree limit. It's not going to happen. I can't imagine that we're going to have billions of dollars a year transferred as in the Copenhagen Accord. I know the Canadian share usually is about 4 or 5% of this. I just can't see in Canada $4 or $5 billion a year being transferred to the Chinese and the Indians. It's not going to happen. We need some different machinery. Doha's stalled. It appears irrevocably. Nuclear proliferation. I mean, we've got the North Koreans and the Iranians now. And poverty depends on your perspective, but we still have billions of people in abject poverty. And a lot of the international institutions cannot reform themselves and need to be reformed. In terms of the argument that it doesn't need saving, you can argue that there are quite a few examples of very serious work where the existing machinery did function well. And we have to worry about the fact that this self-selected group, this illegitimate group, the G20, we don't want it undermining the UN. So the G8, I picked this up. This is from the late 90s. Cartoon. The press is very, very dismissive. The cartoonists are very, very cruel. This is Clinton. I don't know if at the back of the room you can actually see it, but it's basically an intensive care unit that each of these countries are in, and really it doesn't diverge from today's reality all that much. I agree with Timothy Garton-Ash. Now, Daniel Price in April came up with this quote, which I've used for the title of the presentation, and his argument is basically the same as the Korean Il Kong, who was responsible for setting up the Seoul summit. He argued that we really have to not dilute the focus by adding heavyweight issues, was his quote, like climate change. Do not dilute the focus. It's got to stick to its knitting. We have to guard against, as he says, mission creep. This is the G20 as steering group cartoon. I just wanted to remind you what a G20 table looks like. This is a picture of each of the 5 summits, the first one called by Bush, then Pittsburgh, London, Toronto, and Seoul. And the critical thing that I'd like you to derive from these photographs is that we have to realize that nothing really can happen at that meeting with 50 people around the table for a short period of time unless there's very extensive, highly professional preparation. So the G20, who's in it? You're familiar with the 19 countries plus the EU. On the right-hand side of the Rubik's Cube are the agenda topics, very heavy agenda. Korea dealing with the pressure from the Spanish, the Dutch, the Nordics, and other countries hammering to get in, issued in effect 12 more invitations, amongst them the UN Secretary General, and 4 other countries to represent regional groups. This is what the French are doing. Singapore is very clever, set up the 3G group of these 27 small countries. So there's going to be, again, well more than 20 people around the table. So one of the questions is whether or not the group is too big. The theory of coalitions tells you stick to 3 countries. Especially if we have to do stuff that's going to stretch them beyond what they would automatically do in a bilateral arrangement. Side payments makes the point that we have to deal with package deals. We have to create package deals if we're going to have an effective coalition. And again, that makes the point that there's got to be excellent preparation. We've got to have far-sighted thinking. And here, there's really a problem because, as Mathis Wackernagel said, politicians are caught in a dilemma between political suicide and ecological suicide. It's difficult if you're a politician to be far-sighted and remain in office. And we've got to do issue linkage, which is a difficult thing politically. The G20 is going to be known for its performance. Is it effective or not? And this cartoon demonstrates that the cartoonists are just as cruel now as they were to Clinton in the late 90s. Now, what we were told by Bruce Jennelson yesterday was that we're past the stage where there's a fellowship of the lifeboat. Many people believe it is a zero-sum world. We're not going to get anywhere on collective action or on public goods, unless, Bruce said, state interests have to converge. We have to believe that everybody's interests converge. But beyond that, he told us that was a necessary but not sufficient condition. He told us that states also have to have convergent priorities, and even that's not sufficient. There's another condition he told us, which is we have to have similar strategies. Unless you have an understanding that we've got similar interests, similar priorities, and similar strategies, Bruce said it's not going to happen. So the constraints on a G20 host, anybody who's given the position of Sherpa for the host country immediately does some introspection on how what could they have done to sin in a previous life that would require this. Asking a current Sherpa what is the thing that is most looked forward to, the answer is it's being over. This is a really tough job if you list all of the constraints, which I'm not going to read out to you because I don't have time. So I just want to remind you here the legacy issues from previous summits. I mentioned remits. In the past, Seoul's established a whole bunch of tasks and provided remits to different international organizations, to different groups of their own ministers, to different technical working groups that they've established. And all of these tasked groups have to report and back to Cannes, back to the summit, and that group of 35 or 40 people around the table are supposed to deal with the recommendations from all of these tasks. So it's an over-constrained system. Criteria for future issues. If you want to make the argument that some topics should be on the agenda, you're going to have to demonstrate that there's a need for collective action. The last one, some prospects of success, goes back to Bruce's point that people have to have similar priorities and strategies. There has to be an immediate crisis that's recognizable everywhere in addition to the need for collective action. But also, I've had some colleagues say, no, the real thing is not an immediate crisis. The crisis, if it's foreseeable, if it's inevitable, then, and there's a leadership vacuum, then we should do it. Another way to frame it is that the G20 has to be the last resort, otherwise you just do not put it on this already over-constrained agenda. We had a conference here about a month ago where we had a series of experts who each made the pitch for these various issues given the criteria that I've listed, and this was a surprising result. Given that it's a Saturday morning, we decided to not force you to fill out a ballot, so you don't have to do that today. But if anybody really feels strongly in the discussion, please make it clear what your feelings are. If you feel that the issue that should be on the agenda is trade, the Doha round, then these are a couple of things that the G20 could do in terms of not dealing with the issue at the table, not trying to negotiate a solution at the table, but commissioning work that might lead to a more happy outcome in the future. Similarly, on energy and climate change, there's a series of things that the G20 could do in terms of requesting reports or establishing working groups. Some people believe that the oceans, the conditions of the oceans, is that inevitable train wreck coming, and that we just don't have the machinery for it. That a very felicitous action the G20 could take is to get some work started so that in some future year we can actually deal with the problem. There's a series of things that could be done. Nuclear proliferation, I don't know. The international institutions is an interesting question. The obvious point is that in the United Nations, if anything actually gets done, it's usually done not because 192 people sitting around a table simultaneously agree that the light bulb went on. Smaller groups of people get together. There's some sort of caucus, some sort of group that coalesces. The issue is if the G20 can set up working groups or make some decisions amongst themselves as to what should be done with respect to some of the reform questions of international institutions, it could then agree to work together in the UN and in the legitimate processes. The issue is whether or not the G20 is that group. Probably I made the point that the G20 preparation process is really critical. It's the work that goes into the summit, that precedes the summit, the several months before the summit, that really matters. So what could be done on helping that preparatory process? The Koreans did a great job on outreach. The question is whether or not that can be done even better. Because all the people who are not at the table have to feel that their voice is heard in the G20 process, and that after the meeting, the results and the discussions are reported out. We've got to have transparency. And then finally, I don't think the thing's going to work unless we have a flexible secretariat. I've called it a non-secretariat. I've written on that. And the way to do it without worrying about an ossified bureaucracy or some independent group of officials that's not at the beck and call of leaders. This has to be a leaders-led process. One way to do it is to just have officials seconded. So I just want to end with reminding you of a little debate that Colin Bradford had with Daniel Dresner. Bradford, in many more words than these 3 lines, pointed out that it's terrific. And then Dresner called it a dead form walking. Bradford didn't like that. He came back and said, "You don't understand, Dresner. The G20 is not an event, it's a process." And Dresner said, well, he's still underwhelmed. So I think I'm going to leave it there. We just don't want to be in this situation in 2050. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Sam, shall we start right away?
I have no PowerPoints and no jokes, I'm afraid. So I'll just get straight into it. That was a really excellent presentation from Barry. I want to address 3 issues. Can we draw conclusions about the legitimacy of the UN Security Council from the stalled negotiations on council reform at a time of the proactive evolution of the G20? Second, I'd like to make some observations about how the 2 bodies' composition, particularly in relation to smaller powers and developing countries, relates to their legitimacy in the light of their function. And third, I want to make some concluding remarks about the likelihood and possible shape of Security Council reform and how this might address the dilemma of middle and major power representation. So on the first one, some commentators have contrasted the rapid creation of the G20 with the stalled negotiations on council reform. They've noted that the G20 contains a majority of the economically powerful and emerging powers that either already have a permanent seat on the Security Council or are seeking one. From this, they've drawn conclusions that either the pace of reform or the absence of those powers in the permanent membership of the Council demonstrates a lack of legitimacy in the UN Security Council. Caution is needed before drawing this conclusion for 3 main reasons. I have to battle a thunderstorm here as well. So caution is needed for 3 reasons. First, the absence of reform of the Council over 17 years of the recent phase of negotiations does not of itself demonstrate a lack of representative legitimacy, just a failure of a handful of states to secure increased status recognition from their peers. Indeed, what it does demonstrate is that at least a third of UN member states, sufficient to block any reform, view the status quo as superior, more legitimate than any specific reform proposal. It also appears from the recent initiative of the group of 4 aspirant countries that a majority of member states are not yet willing to commit to an expansion in both categories. Second, an assessment of the legitimacy of the Council's representativity cannot be confined to a review of its permanent membership, since other representational factors, such as the balance of developing to developed countries and the regional compositional balance, are as or more salient in assessing legitimacy through the lens of composition, representation, or democratic criteria. Moreover, the fact of a 2-tier council, even despite contestations over the composition of that category, may in itself be seen as more legitimate in the whole than a non-differentiated composition, given that the qualified majority voting in the Council is paired with privileges and protection for the most powerful countries to incentivize their working within that structure. And third, the legitimacy of the Council is not confined to, or indeed best captured by, issues of representation and membership. So when comparing the G20 to the Security Council, there's a question of the link between composition and function. The criteria for G20 selection is essentially GDP, with some tweaking for other factors, which is a good selection criteria for comparing it with institutions where you need to mobilize the economic muscle of countries. But it's less clear that an ideal or improved Security Council composition would result from the increase in members of permanent or non-permanent members from powerful countries. The Security Council from its foundation was a delicate marriage of power and representation and accountability, with a number of non-permanent members to be selected from both medium and small states, deliberately set to outnumber the larger powers, 6 to 5 in 1945 and 10 to 5 since 1965 to the present. A key difference with the G20 was that the Security Council was established with the consent of many smaller powers, at that time largely just from Europe and Latin America, and that having powerful countries with particular privileges, the veto and permanency, was seen as a strength, especially given lessons from the League, but a strength that brought attendant risks that needed mitigation through mechanisms of voting majorities. So the P5 could not pass a resolution without at least some non-permanent member support. Some, albeit weak, accountability links through Security Council reports to the larger General Assembly, and expectations of the adoption of additional responsibilities on the part of the permanent members. So the value of smaller states to the legitimacy of the Council can be more than just an enhancement of accountability. Some states which are small economically may have particular diplomatic strengths that further the Council's work. Singapore has made a valuable contribution to advancing Council mechanisms. Norway mediated between the Israeli and Palestinian representatives. This is increasingly recognized in the G20 evolution through invitations to representatives of the 3G Global Governance Group to attend summits. The Security Council has had a long history of electing such members to its membership, and in particular the presence of 3 African countries on the Council during a period when the majority of the UN's peacekeeping and political missions are located in Africa, has the potential both to contribute vital regional knowledge and to add a legitimacy to Council decisions to use force, especially when the conflicts are largely intrastate and when the legacy of colonialism creates additional mistrust of external intervention. It was notable that the Libyan rebels announced that an international intervention that was not authorized by the Security Council would lack legitimacy and would risk mobilizing nationalist sentiment in support of the Gaddafi regime. The Council also has a swing seat to ensure the constant representation of an Arab or Islamic country, but it rotates between the African and Asian groups. Concerns about inadequate African and Muslim and Arab representation on the G20 have led to invitations to the African Union and League of Arab States to attend summits. Another subtle but important difference in the way the G20 and the Council address representation of developing countries. Through its inclusion of India, the G20 captures a larger proportion of developing country populations than the UN Security Council. But since its reform in 1965, the Council has a majority of developing country states in most years in its membership. Really depends year to year. If Japan or Korea is not occupying one of the Asian seats, then there are 8 developing countries to 7, or vice versa when they are. In the case of the 19 base states of the G20, only 8 are developing and 11 are developed. In the G13, the ratio is starker, with 5 developing and 8 developed. Again, this demonstrates how the legitimacy of representation can only be assessed when related to the expected function of the body concerned, and is a reminder of how perceptions of legitimacy also depend on one's perspective, since for many developing country representatives, both small and large, it may be better to have the voices of a majority of large, medium and smaller developing countries at the table than a minority of the largest developing countries. Now, it may well be that the respective G77 to OECD ratios are actually suited to each of these bodies' respective purposes. I make no claims about the merits of that. But one concern about any future expansion of the Council is that it would jeopardize this delicate balance of power and representation by over-representing the developing world. Moreover, the 1965 expansion is one of the reasons why the clamour for reform has largely been restricted to a few powerful aspirant permanent members, since developing countries as a bloc already have the 7 votes required to block any non-procedural resolution of the Council. It's often overlooked that the 1965 expansion changed the power balance on the Council fundamentally. Before 1965, almost all the vetoes cast were by the Soviet Union. After 1965, almost all the vetoes have been cast by the Western permanent members. The evidence also just suggests that there are a number of factors that influence perceptions of legitimacy more than composition. An important part of the perceived legitimacy of the Council is that it acts within a legal UN Charter framework which delimited its powers, albeit that the Security Council was given a wide berth to interpret their extent. Part of the Council's legitimacy for smaller states lies in the way that it can act to deter the use of force by powerful countries absent Council authorization. Even when it cannot deter, bypassing the Council can place costs on major powers, including reduced burden-sharing opportunities. Hence, the legitimacy of the Council has taken a hit, largely when it's failed to perform its perceived functions, such as when it's failed to mobilize an effective international response to a threat to peace or the protection of civilians, such as in Rwanda or Srebrenica, or in the eyes of those states concerned that it failed to deter the use of force outside of explicit Council authorization, such as in the case of Iraq, the Iraq War in 2003. It's hard to conclude that an expanded Council, particularly one that would likely comprise a smaller proportion of countries predisposed to international military interventions, would either protect civilians more or decrease the likelihood of unilateral action by states outside of the Council. Indeed, one can argue that the former might actually lead to an increase in the latter. Moreover, the Council's legitimacy, derived from its function as a provider of international public goods, could also be seen to have increased over time, not decreased. In recent years, we've seen a peak in the number of peacekeeping personnel deployed and record peacekeeping budgets. We've had a RAND study citing enhanced efficacy, cost savings and perceived legitimacy value of Council-sanctioned operations over unilateral ones. Other studies have demonstrated a causal link between Council-mandated action and decreases in international conflict. The tools at the disposal of the Council have been honed over the years, ranging from the conflict prevention centres and political missions highlighted by Abby Williams yesterday, to smarter sanctions, greater use of and support for regional mechanisms such as the African Union, links to peace-building and international criminal jurisdictions. Over 90% of resolutions over the last decade have been passed by consensus, and there's been almost universal participation in GA elections to the Security Council. In the case of the G20, I think there's a risk of overestimating the risk or the need for legitimation in the case of past activities such as the major agreement on the stimulus package, since legitimacy is only needed when one is seeking to persuade smaller powers to do things they don't want to do, or if the G20 wants to take action which conflicts with decisions made in other forums. Conversely, objections to the composition of the G20 in the context of actions such as a stimulus package is status-motivated rhetoric, similar to that which I outlined in the Security Council reform debate. But conversely, there's a risk not of overestimating, but of underestimating the need for G20 legitimation when it's seeking to take action in arenas where non-members have contrary interess, such as some of the security areas and some of the development areas where the evolution of global norms says that a genuine partnership between donors and donees is required for legitimacy of development assistance. So how do we explain the frequent rhetoric from member states that the Council risks losing legitimacy if its membership does not reflect the reality of the world today? Part of the explanation is that legitimacy is highly contextual. The same member states that stated for many years that the Council needed to be reformed to be legitimate, the same ones argued at the time of the 2003 war in Iraq that the Council was the font of legitimacy in the face of the US taking action without its explicit approval. Another part of the rhetoric is just that, language used for rhetorical purposes, either because it masks specific national agendas and interests around the pursuit of relative status, or to stop a rival state from gaining elevated status at one's expense, or because it's useful as a bargaining chip for other negotiating goals, such as concessions on working methods from the more powerful states. The third explanation is that member states are partially correct. Over the longer term, a failure of the Council to reflect the external environment risks reducing legitimacy, but the evidence does not suggest that we're there now, or indeed will be there in the near future, since other aspects of the Council's legitimacy are strong, and in many ways superior to other international bodies of limited membership. In the absence of reform, the Council has adapted in a number of ways to mitigate any compositional deficiencies. It's adopted a variety of mechanisms to capture the valuable capabilities and viewpoints of non-members who can contribute to furthering its charter mandate. This includes the evolution of friends groups, contact groups, consultations with troop contributing countries, increased transparency, etc., etc. The evolution of informal functional-based groups, mainly around specific conflict countries and regions, has, as Bruce Gentleson highlighted yesterday afternoon, been well documented by Jochen Prantl and is one way of involving middle powers and other ad hoc key smaller states in a targeted way. Such council practice, not sufficiently known outside of policy circles as it's done at an expert or diplomatic level, has a more public parallel with the variable geometry of the G7 to G20 evolution and the G20 plus evolution. We've had a variety of permutations, including G8 plus 5, the Haile Gendam process, and the G14, including an additional Arab or Islamic member, reflecting in particular the need to involve developing countries in G8 plus reflections on development. And the G20 plus evolution, with a host adding variable countries and representatives of IOs at each meeting, continues this trend. Barry Karen and others in their excellent June 2010 publication on increasing G20 legitimacy and effectiveness reflects on whether a base group of 8, 13, 14 or 20 could be set with countries invited according to the issues being discussed. And this functional geometry fits with the model of the existing Major Economies Forum on Energy and Climate Change, which is a G13 plus Australia, Indonesia and Korea, and the proposal to add New Zealand to the G20 when agriculture is on the table. So I want to kind of finish, if I can, if I've got 5 more minutes, with looking at the prospects for compositional reform of the UN Security Council. When compared to the G8 to E20 expansion, the UN process gives an effective veto to smaller states. While it makes expansion harder, it also potentially means that the literal representational legitimacy of the Council would be enhanced if expansion occurs. But how can an expansion of the Council capture some of the benefits of the flexibility of the variable geometry of the G system within a framework which combines permanent presence of certain individual states with the need to have shared constituency seats? Well, the short answer, it can only happen with luck, since the UN is hostage to having to build on the structures of the past. Combined with the fact that the main driver for reform is individual state status, not Council function or efficacy, and we can see that the ideal type of reform is not inevitable. But interestingly, I think we may, after years of negotiation, now be edging towards the UN's own version of a greater accommodation of middle and major power actors. I've got limited time, so I'm just going to headline my paragraphs on this. Firstly, the bar of the UN Charter is very high. 2/3 of member states in the GA, then 2/3 of member states at parliamentary ratification stage, including the P5, so reform is difficult to get through. Second, unlike the G20, there's no easy objective criteria in the Charter to guide expansion. Permanent members are there because they're there. Article 23 outlines only broad principles for non-permanent election. Thirdly, the win-lose nature of the Council process between the G4 aspirant, Japan, Germany, India, Brazil, 2 Africans, and the Uniting for Consensus group who don't want to see new permanent members. Neither of them at the moment has a 2/3 majority, so they're in a bit of a deadlock. There's a real dilemma for smaller countries that will ultimately decide, since they have the votes, what happens, because there are pros and cons of new permanent members, and neither provides definite improvement on the status quo. If there's new permanent members, there's greater parity with the P5 and getting into that kind of inner cabal of decision making. But on the other hand, there are cons. If you make a developing country permanent, there's less accountability that it would represent the interests of your region or your group. A lesson from the open-ended working group on council reform is how quickly the balance of power changes. 17 years ago, the main leading proposal was a veto and a permanent seat for Japan and Germany and lesser status for developing countries. Now the talk is more about how to accommodate emerging developing powers. The other big difference since San Francisco in 1945 was that the P3 at that time were head and shoulders more powerful than other member states. They brought in China and France onto the council. If you look at the situation now, the tier of aspirant permanent members is quite close to some of the P5. And even more importantly, the next tier down is very close. So in one criteria or another, it beats the aspirant permanent members in their claims for permanency, not in all, but in some. So it's very hard to find objective criteria. Similar dilemmas arise, pros and cons around the veto for both old and new permanent members. So the likely scenario, I think, is a longer duration seat, 15 to 20 years, without veto for 6 countries. And I think that could lead to a good combination of both permanency and the value of that, but still with a link to accountability to a wider group. I'll end with my last paragraph. I thus would support Barry's notion that the G20 will not be the committee to rule the world, but nor would the Security Council. Both bodies struggle with the fact that there is no ideal blueprint to creating and sustaining legitimate international institutional bodies of limited membership. But both bodies have important roles to play at both an expert and leadership level. As Ramesh Thakur has stressed, the real challenge is how to harness the strengths of both major power symmetry and the collectivity of the international community. In Ramesh's words, the real challenge is how to retain the positive attributes of the existing major nodes of global governance while shedding their pathologies. Thank you very much.
I'd like to just begin by thanking ACUNS for the opportunity to be with you again today. I was at the conference in Trinidad 2 years ago, and I have very fond memories, and so it's a real pleasure to be here again today. I've been asked to speak about the rising states, the rising powers, and how they may be reshaping the global governance system. To me, this is a very interesting topic. Why are the rising states or the rising powers interesting from the standpoint of the global system? I think they represent the crystallization of the main themes of our panel this morning. The idea of universal and the functional, and the question of global management. The tensions within each of these areas, the tensions between these areas, And so the rising states, to me, represent a very interesting focal point around which to actually analyze this tension between functional concerns and legitimacy concerns within the global system. Doesn't seem to be working. Okay. The main question for my presentation today is, what is the systemic impact of the concurrent rise of China, India, and Brazil, and the return of Russia? I think we all, it's in the media every day. We know that these emerging countries are rising. But what's the impact on the global system? I think this is the backdrop to much of the thinking on global governance Barry and Sam have talked about, thinking about the technical issues and the political and diplomatic questions. This is part of the broader structural change question, changes in geopolitics and political economy that really shape the context within which the diplomatic efforts are tried. U.S. foreign policy specialists have tended to frame this debate in terms of whether the rising powers are challenging the Western liberal order or choosing to join or work within it. Right? Whether China, India, Brazil are status quo powers or revisionist powers. It's not just in the United States, also in Europe and other places I've heard the question of the rise of these countries, these nations, framed in that status quo versus revisionist power debate. But I think that question actually is not that relevant anymore. I think instead the real question now is how far and how fast do the rising powers intend to reshape institutional arrangements of global governance and the international order more broadly. So it's not a question of whether, but how far, how fast. Right, of course, those who are students of political science know there are differences between the international system and the order more broadly. And part of my discussion keeps those conceptual distinctions in mind. From the research that we've done at CG, and at times with colleagues at Chatham House, I think what we found is that the question of how far and how fast do these rising powers want to change the system, this is still an ongoing debate inside the quarters of power in Beijing and Brasilia and Delhi. Right. At times, they're willing to work within the system. At times, they want to push beyond. How much that balance depends in part on how the traditional powers respond to the rise of these emerging countries. Right. So that dialectical, reciprocal relationship. Close analysis of the actual roles of these rising powers in reshaping the international monetary and financial system, we suggest, provides a useful lens for actually studying the strategic positioning and intention of these rising states within the Bretton Woods order. Right? Not only power capability, but purpose. And I think it's this tension, how much power versus what do they really want? Right? We're all struggling in one way or another with this question. I dedicate a lot of my research to this, especially on the question of China, but also China in relation to Brazil and India. I think one of the main findings is that the strategic outcome, so the intention that the rising powers are trying to push for, is one, a shift in the world economy and the global order to a less centralized, more multipolar and multi-layered world order. Right? Less centralized, multipolar, multi-layered. Global, regional, national, subnational. Where rising states have more influence in shaping the agenda, priorities, and rules and norms of global governance. One of the things that's really interesting about this current moment in world history is that it's not just one or two countries rising to challenge the so-called hegemonic power, right, if you want the United States, but it's their simultaneous rise, and also how they self-identify as a group, and how they self-identify in their location within the world economy. Right? Encapsulated by how they represent themselves, these rising powers, you see both top-down and bottom-up dimensions of world power in their self-identification. They represent themselves not only as major emerging economies, but also as bridges and voices of the South at global forums. Right? It's contestable how much that is actually the case. But we see, for example, in the G20, right, there's been a consistent push from these major rising powers and working with other emerging countries such as Indonesia within the G20 to push for major reforms in the Bretton Woods institutions. And so I think what is so interesting about the rise of this group is that they're actually trying to consciously ensure that their rise is happening simultaneously, not one of them sticking their head out too far. They also offer, I think this is where how they went into the global financial crisis and how they've come out of the global financial crisis is also very important. Right? That makes us very interested in these rising states. Right? They've come out of it in many ways stronger than they went into the crisis. Now, if the world economy goes into a prolonged slump, they will be affected too. But we know from the standpoint of reserve accumulation, reserves have gone up. It hasn't fallen. Right? Their overall growth GDP-wise continues to rise. Incomes continue to rise in these countries. Right? Their own developmental capacity, their own developmental autonomy seems to be increasing, even as they become more integrated into the global economy. They're starting to offer lessons and models and best practices within international development and the global economy, economics, which challenge traditional thinking or established thinking. And I think what's most interesting is, unlike previous periods of rising states or where the South has tried to work together, Bandung, call for a new international economic order, coming out of this crisis, this coalition hasn't weakened. They've actually gotten stronger in some ways, individually and interestingly, as a group, the cooperation between them. Right? Perhaps collective action is too strong of a term, right? If we think about various degrees of international cooperation. But I think from things such as the BRIC summits that were launched from 2009 onwards, every year, this BRICS grouping, they continue to meet. And a lot is going on between them now as they try to work. And I think what's most interesting among this grouping of states is that they are conscious that by working together, they can exert leverage on the system. So part of it is their weight within the world economy, but part of it is their growing consciousness, self-identification, and how they're situating themselves within the world consciously. I'm conscious of time, so hopefully you'll let me know if yeah. What is so interesting, I think, with the rising states is how they've responded before the global financial crisis and after the global financial crisis. We all know that with the global financial crisis, we've seen the rise of this G20 leaders process. Before the global financial crisis, the rising states were actually not as involved diplomatically in engaging in the Bretton Woods system. Of course, they were attending meetings of the IMF, the World Bank. But what was so interesting is if you look at the Brazilian president, Lula at the time, the Chinese leaders, India, they were engaging in what many people would call a lot of routing around behavior, right? A lot of South-South. We've been hearing about this. Visits by President Lula 35 times to Africa. The Chinese leaders, right, the 8 members of the Politburo Standing Committee have each gone to Africa numerous times. Other parts of Asia, other parts of the South, Latin America. There was a lot of this kind of routing around South-to-South activity going on. And when the global financial crisis hit, we actually had a research group that's still ongoing in a collaboration with Chatham House in the UK, where we studied how were these rising states responding to the global financial crisis. At the time, we thought that they would potentially pursue regional options or work really hard at the bilateral level to increase their South-South activity. Because we felt at the time, we knew there was a loss of legitimacy of the Bretton Woods institution, especially the IMF, in the eyes of these rising states and among many Asian countries. But what's interesting coming out, like how they responded to that crisis, was that actually the BRIC countries re-engaged more heavily in the Bretton Woods system, pushing, though, for reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions. At the same time, though, they continued their routing around behavior. So they have 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But they definitely increased their diplomatic engagement in the Bretton Woods, pushing for IFI reform. Right, so you see China, Brazil, India at the G20 meetings pushing very hard for changes in representation and in the operating norms and lending norms of the IFIs, both the World Bank and the IMF. Right? And so what's so interesting is they didn't actually disengage from the system, they became more engaged. Now since that was the initial response. If we actually look now 2 years back, that was probably a first order response. Because, for example, for the Asian countries, China and India, the crisis didn't erupt in the Asian region. It erupted in the Anglo-American world, spreading to Europe. So the response wasn't just the internal regional response by the Asians, but the need to get together for a global response with the G20. Right? So that was the initial response, first order response. And to try to change the system, though, from the standpoint of developing country concerns of how the crisis was going to fall out across the world. Second order response, though, is we do see an increase in interest in regional organization, second order response coming out of the global financial crisis and the global economic crisis. And so we see these two tracks going on, both global and regional, coming out of the interest of the emerging powers. And so the rising states, we see through the various global institutions, G20, UN system, other global forums for the previous G8 plus G5, but also at the bilateral level for China at the strategic and economic dialogue with the United States. Consistently, the BRIC countries have pushed for reforms in the IFIs, in the Bretton Woods institutions, and how they operate. To me, one of the most interesting things that I think the BRICS actually highlight is a problem actually in how political scientists have been conceptualizing the crisis of global governance. We tend to think of the current crisis of global governance as a crisis of representation and effectiveness. I think what actually the BRICS show us is that the current crisis, it highlights two dimensions actually of a legitimacy crisis. It's not legitimacy on the one hand, effectiveness on the other. In Western political theory, there are actually at least two conceptions of legitimacy. One is representational legitimacy, another is operational legitimacy, performance legitimacy. One is Rousseau, the other is Weber. The way we've tended to think about legitimacy is overemphasizing, I would argue, representational legitimacy. It's important, don't get me wrong. And the BRIC countries raised the representational legitimacy question right in the forefront. But it's actually two dimensions of a legitimacy crisis, rather than legitimacy on one side, effectiveness on the other. And this tension crystallizes actually in the rising powers. And I think part of how we've not understood the challenge of the rising countries is because of how we conceptualize the challenge of global governance. And let me say a couple things. So on these two dimensions of a legitimacy crisis, IMF internal governance reforms, we've seen it regularly, this representational question. Right? It's very interesting. I think it's taken a while, but it's taken a while to bring the more established or traditional powers to deal with this question. Right? We know that a number of the developing countries and the emerging countries have kept pushing. Washington, London, Toronto, Seoul, Paris, for further reforms of the IMF to better reflect the emerging structure of the world economy and weight within it. We've seen this most recently in the joint statement from the BRIC countries about the selection of the next head of the IMF, right? For the selection to be based on merit, not on nationality, or not on established protocol or procedure. And I think that that's one dimension where we clearly see this representational crisis. And there's no way for the Bretton Woods institutions to sidestep this issue, or for the traditional powers to sidestep this issue. This will keep coming as the shift in the global economy, if it continues on its current track. But the second one is performance legitimacy. And I think this is where we can see that the IMF, we had a great presentation here actually a couple of nights ago. The Independent Evaluation Office linked to the IMF, or the Independent Evaluation Office overseeing the IMF or watching the IMF, they came out with a very good report recently about the IMF kind of sleeping at the switch while they were getting warnings about impending global financial crisis. And the interesting question is, why didn't the IMF act the way we needed it to? Right? Quite a damning report, actually. I thought very courageous. But coming out of that crisis, what we've seen is the developing countries and the BRIC countries have pushed for changes in IMF lending norms, right? From pro-cyclical to counter-cyclical. Right? This has been a very important shift, I would say, for crisis response. The interesting question is whether this will be a sustained shift in IMF lending norms. And if we remember back to the Asian financial crisis, right? Korea, Southeast Asia, IMF came in with the medicine of pro-cyclical. Now there's a recognition, not only from Asia, but Brazil, counter-cyclical. President Lula was very strong on this, right? He calls it anti-cyclical. So there we see two elements of how these rising powers are reshaping the global economic governance. I'll wrap up now. The interesting question is, what's going on beyond these Bretton Woods institutions, though, in the Bretton Woods order? I've already mentioned South-South ties, regional institution options, and China, India, Brazil are all promoting new regional options inside the regions, as well as strengthening the regional development banks. I think we're heading towards a more fractured, fragmented global governance system, right, where you have the IFIs at the top, but then you also have a number of these regional banks playing a certain role. I can talk about that during the Q&A if anyone's interested, because actually coming out of the G20, important devolution of responsibilities were given to regional development banks. But what we see is this kind of hedging behavior right now, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. I think so far, these alternative regional institutions are supplemental to the Bretton Woods order. But if we don't see reform happening quick enough in the IFIs and far enough, then I think the rising powers will begin to explore more and more these regional options. And we probably can't blame them, because it has to do with these two legitimacy crises. The cumulative impact, again, then, is this shift towards a less centralized, more multi-layered and multi-centered world order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alistair, can we continue for 10 more minutes since we start very late? All right, so why don't I just collect some questions from the floor and just go afterwards. Lorraine? Maybe this is only for you. Maybe just briefly answer. Okay. Yes, yes.
I've been asked to answer that. Is this on?
Mm-hmm.
I've been asked to answer briefly. I can't. Is this thing working now? Hi. I guess my disclaimer wasn't clear at the beginning. You know, I tried to apologize for being an economist. Maybe I should rephrase it, Professor Elliott. On the first day, God created the sun. So then what happened was the devil countered and created sunburn. On the second day, God created sex. The devil thought about that for a while and countered and created marriage. On the third day, God created an economist. That was a tough one for the devil. He thought about it for a while, but then he figured out what to do. He created a second economist. I think the answer to the question is that if the G20 provides the remit, then that sort of binds countries like China, India, and Brazil in as co-authors. If they really sign on to the remit, I think they're likely to treat the results of the work and the recommendations and potential policy options much more seriously than if it's, you know, like in development, there's a lot of work going on in the DAC at the OECD, but that's of no consequence, I think, to the Chinese and the Indians.
Thank you. Eldo?
Yes, my question also for Mr. Karin, because you touched briefly on transparency in the G20, and I want to, you cannot hear me well?
I can, I don't understand.
Can you speak again?
Yes. My question is about transparency in the G20.
About what? Transparency. Okay.
Something is wrong with the, maybe if I'm further. My question is about transparency in the G20. You touched upon that in your presentation. And I want to get your view. As you know, there is the development working group set up in the G20. And one thing that has been done in that group now is it has requested a number of papers from intergovernmental, teams of intergovernmental agencies. But the interesting, tricky thing here is that it's not the agencies that are submitting the reports. These are individuals seconded by the agencies on their personal capacity, which represents an interesting development because, for example, whereas in the IMF, if the IMF had been requested to prepare something that would have gone to the board, now you don't have that process, which is a safeguard for the member states, about what is done by the staff. Now you have a staff person channeling that directly into the G20, and this is, of course, something that is not disclosed anywhere. So, civil society worked years to get the IMF to be more open, but now that process is sort of being sidestepped because a staff person can actually send something without following any of the processes for consultation that the IMF instituted. And I mentioned the IMF, but this is true for all the other agencies that, they have each their own processes and they all are parts of these teams. So there are two ways to react to this. One would be, if I heard your presentation and I read it well, basically to say, anyway, nobody's going to decide anything in this group, so it doesn't matter that there weren't all these processes there. Or one could take the opposite view and say this is a dramatic change to how we have seen global institutions act in the past. It's a subversion, you could say, of transparency and the approaches to governance in global institutions. So maybe if you could say a bit about how do you see this development in your view, is where would you stand between those two extremes? Thank you.
Can I collect more questions? I can see you guys. Anybody? Okay.
Well, I have no problem. Being an economist, I can subscribe to both extremes. I have two arms. I think to be serious for a moment, I think that the G20's at a point where we're not clear which way it's going to go as to whether or not it's really going to matter or not. It has to deliver on its current commitments, or else people aren't going to take it seriously. They'll have the Dresdner kind of approach. In terms of all of the preparatory work, I think with one caveat, it pays to be transparent. Why not lay out all the options that are being considered by working groups? It can't hurt to have all of the various strategies and options public. Why not? The caveat is that we have to be serious in terms of what actually happens in a real negotiation. We're never going to have a system where the actual negotiation between intergovernmental representatives is going to be done in an open, televised fashion. We have to allow for the possibility that in a closed group, in a closed room, they're going to see whether or not they can hammer out an agreement. But in terms of all of the source documents, I don't see any reason why we can't provide for complete transparency on the options that are being proposed by various parties.
Anybody else? If so, can I just give a couple of minutes to other presenters to either respond or have additional comments, what you missed during your presentation? Maybe Gregory first?
I had one last thing I want to say. One thing I wanted to mention, I worry about the harsh chairmanship of Shin-wha, so I had to keep my remarks shorter. I wanted to remind you of something that is ascribed to Deng Xiaoping. The G20 is only going to work if there's real leadership, and we're going to have some of that leadership from the Chinese side. And maybe Greg will have something to say about this, but it's ascribed to Deng Xiaoping that he said, quote, observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, be good at maintaining a low profile, never claim leadership. Now, if that's going to be the Chinese approach in the G20, we're not going to have as successful a future as we might have otherwise.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, Barry, about China. I think what your point raises is the fact that for China, it's clearly not just a question of power, but also purpose. And the Chinese have increasing weight within the global economy, but what do they want to do with it? And clearly they're debating this issue. I think there are people now, though, I think you'll find hope in the fact that there are people now in Beijing and inside the inner policy circles of the party, government, and think tanks, which are asking the question, whether we need to go beyond Deng Xiaoping's lie low and, conceal brilliance. They realize now that the pressure on China coming from the outside is immense, right? For China to do more, right? You can't just keep flying under the radar. At the same time, the need for reforms inside China to move towards a different growth model. We just learned that cancer is now the #1 killer in China, which obviously is linked to environmental concerns in China. But also the need to change the growth model towards a more domestic-oriented growth model. I think one of the things that we shouldn't assume is the Chinese for 20 years, it's very interesting. Last summer at Peking University, I listened to top economists in China say, we kept fueling the Americans and their consumption because we thought this is what we needed to do to keep the growth going. And obviously it's worked in some ways for China. We also thought eventually the Americans might correct themselves and that they might do the right thing and, slowly reducing their consumption and easing up on their pressure on us on the exchange rate. But we clearly see there is no easing up on the exchange rate pressure. and therefore China has to find a different approach. And this has been, I think, an important paradigm shift in the thinking of top policymakers in the party in China. The hard part now is actually making those shifts. But the ideational change has already started. And so they're now searching for the new vocabulary, the new vision, beyond what Mao and Deng has left for them, and trying to find the new solutions. And I think that they will come up with some very interesting things. And we're seeing it very cautiously at first in the exchange rate discussions, but more importantly, behind the exchange rate, at the monetary. The gradual push for internationalizing the renminbi, watching while the Russians now start trying to play around with the ruble internationalization, the SDR questions, alternative global reserve currencies. We've talked about this prior. The Chinese are thinking very seriously about this as they sit on their $3 trillion US.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you very much. This session was about the new geometry of Summitry. Just like a new and old Summitry, I think whatever the issues and who are the major players are there, how to pursue performance and legitimacy at the same time is always the hard task. So this is the end of our plenary session number 2, and I'm sure the coffee break is waiting for us. Thank you very much.
Post MDGs, which Barry Karen is co-leading with Mukesh Kapila from the Federation of the Red Cross. As for myself, having completed the work on nuclear governance, I'm back to my favorite subject, UN reform, and I will attempt to document, to provide a comprehensive picture of all the reforms, and there were many, that were introduced in the UN since the end of the Cold War. Finally, and to mention all our connections with the UN, the chair of CG's board, Jim Balsillie, is currently serving on the UN's Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability. Its final report is expected by the end of 2011. And the panel has been asked to explore approaches for building a low-carbon, green, and resilient economy that can also work to eradicate poverty. This morning, we have 2 panels that will explore the state of the international system. The first panel, which is sponsored by CG, will examine the new geometry of Summitry. And you have a number of very distinguished panelists to address this issue. The second panel, which as you know is sponsored by the Stanley Foundation, will delve into the concept of adaptive leadership. And we can look forward to an analytical discussion of global citizenship and the norms and values attached to its practice. So this promises to be a very interesting and stimulating Saturday morning. And without further ado, I will invite the moderator of the panel, Shin-wha Lee, to take over the proceedings. Thank you very much. Welcome again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very beautiful building. I'm happy to be here this morning. Well, since we are running late, we'll just start our roundtable right away. This panel is on new geometry of Summitry for universal and functional issues management. Well, concerning the future of G20, a lot have been talked, whether we have to stay at the leaders level or it should return to the finance ministers meeting. But presuming it stays at the leaders level, at least 3 questions might be raised. Just briefly, first, will the G20 stick to an economic and financial sectors or extend their leadership to a broader agenda? Of course, the G20 has been discussing about pressing hybrid issues such as economic or global implication of global climate change or global pandemic issues. But what about the purely or largely political security issues at the leaders level? And then that leads to our second question, how to balance with the existing multilateral mechanisms such as G8, IMF, and the UN. In this year, 2011, the 10 G20 members, that means 6 G8 members are on the seat of the Security Council. Then this kind of overlap will be good for partnership between G20 and UN, or that's going to be conflicting each other, or that will eventually G20 can replace the role of the UN. It's those questions we can think about. Lastly, role of the middle power leadership. Although G20 is the partnership or relation with the external existing international organizations, I believe that there are also a lot of internal challenges which are derived from different philosophies or experience, language, or culture, or conflicting interests.
Environment, development, and security. We focus primarily on the analysis of governance institutions and mechanisms to gauge their effectiveness, legitimacy, relevance, and impact. And we see our missions as building bridges between the research community and the policy community, with the aim of advancing credible research that can lead to policy innovations. As Tom Burns told you on Thursday evening, a major program priority has been and continues to be the G20 and the functioning of the international financial system. A number of major pieces of work have come out of CG in the recent past. One, a major report on the Financial Stability Board, which tracked performance of this new body over its first year of operation. We've also published a report with Chatham House on the G20's efforts to promote economic policy coordination among its industrialized and emerging nation members. Many projects currently underway in CG relate to high-priority issues in the United Nations itself. I'm thinking here of our work on security sector governance, on climate change, or on the strengthening of the IAEA, which is a follow-on to a 3-year project which I chaired on the so-called nuclear renaissance and its implication for global governance in matters of nuclear safety, security, and cooperation. The report was issued in February 2010, and it contains a number of recommendations for improved international cooperation, some of which have turned out to be particularly pertinent in the light of the Fukushima disaster. We also have a number of projects relating to development issues, including a major Africa initiative and a more recent project on development paradigm. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to CG. You may have noticed all these barrels stacked up in the other room there, and you may think that our research here is fueled by vast quantities of alcohol. Well, that's not the reason why we have all these big barrels there. It's because this building, many of you have commented on what a beautiful building this is. Well, this building used to be a warehouse for the Seagram distillery. Seagram is the distillery that makes the Crown Royal whiskeys, the rye whiskey. This is a building that was constructed in 1857, and in the 1980s it became the company museum, and then it was purchased by CG. You've also noticed a big construction site right next to it. Well, that's the CG campus that's expanding. In fact, the expansion is quite a bit bigger than the original CG. And the CG campus will house, as of this coming September, the Balsillie School of International Affairs, which is a unique partnership involving CG, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the University of Waterloo. This school, the Balsillie School, already exists, and over the last 4 years it has offered interdisciplinary master's program in global governance and international public policy, as well as a unique PhD program in global governance. Now, CG has 4 core programs: global economy, energy, and
of its member state is always there. In that case, what would be the role of middle power leadership or rising powers role within G20 or within the United Nations? So having said those things, I'm privileged to have the most distinguished scholars who tackled with these issues. So let's go for Barry Karen first on G20, and then the G8, G20 evolution, and the UN particular Security Council issues in Sam Do, and then finally the rising power on the Gregory Chin. So let's start with Barry.
Well, I did.
Firing it up now.
Firing it.
Is that yours? Okay.
Well, good morning. It's a privilege to be here. Let me start with a couple of disclaimers and an aphorism, I guess, or a story. First disclaimer is I have to apologize. I was trained as an economist. I'm an economist. An economist is someone who does not know what he's talking about and makes it feel that it's your fault. And the second disclaimer, I think, given the amount of time that I've been allotted, 10 or 15 minutes, I remind myself of something Pedro Milan once said was, this complex topic I've worked on for years. Asked my wife, how am I going to explain to these people everything that I know, all the stuff that I know, everything that I have to communicate in just 10 minutes? And she said, speak very slowly.